So in this video, I want to briefly talk about what we call the Pastoral Epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. They're called the Pastoral Epistles because Paul is writing to pastors. Timothy and Titus are pastors of the churches where when he writes to them. So what is the main issue in the pastoral epistles? That's going to be the first thing that we cover. I would like you also to know why it's unlikely that Paul wrote these letters. We've sort of covered that this semester already. And then I want to talk about the background of 1 Timothy, especially chapter 2. A lot of people think that, in fact, the majority of scholarship tends to agree that these three letters were not written by Paul. They are the most heavily disputed of all of Paul's letters, meaning that the vast majority of people tend to think that Paul did not write these particular letters, and we'll talk about why that is in just a second. The overall theme, though, of what Paul is all about here is the idea of church structure. That's the theme. That's what the pastoral epistles are all about, is the idea of church structure. Who should be in charge? What is the role of a deacon? What's the role of a pastor or an elder? He's trying to create some sort of hierarchy, some sense of structure going on here. That's the point of these pastoral epistles. Here's a little bit about who Titus is. I don't want to say too much there. You can pause and read through this slide here. I'd like to focus a little bit more on why Titus, and kind of by extension 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, are so heavily disputed, and why so many people don't think Paul wrote these particular letters. Paul mentions that Titus is in Crete when Paul writes to him. Now, there's really, and in addition to that, Paul mentions that he has visited Titus on Crete. The issue, though, is that we really can't find any opportunity based on the book of Acts or Paul's letters when Paul would have visited the island of Crete and ministered there prior to the year 64 AD, when we tend to assume Paul died, as I mentioned earlier in class. Now, if Paul did make it past the year 64 or AD, then it is possible that Paul would have written the letter to Titus, but that would mean that Paul had a missionary career after the year 64 that's not documented by the book of Acts or any other sources there. Now, that's not the only reason why we think that Paul may not have written these letters. In addition to that, we don't really see Paul expressing concern for church offices, who's filling what role in his undisputed letters. The idea of who should be an elder, who should be a deacon, those kinds of issues don't show up in Paul's letters written in 50 AD. It's not something he worries about in Thessalonians, in Philippians, in Romans. And so the idea is, the theory is that Paul is writing early in the history of Christianity, and he thinks Jesus is coming back. He's not trying to create an institutional church that's going to survive for hundreds of years. And so he's not worried with establishing church offices like elder and deacon. But later on, after Paul dies, and after it becomes clear that the church is going to have to survive because we might have to wait for Jesus to come back, somebody else comes along and pretends to be Paul and establishes these offices and explains what the role of an elder, what the role of a deacon is, because the church needs to have some structure, some hierarchy, some offices to keep surviving for the 2,000 years that it has, even unto this day. Lastly, we also notice that the teachings in the pastoral epistles, or the false teachings that is expressed, tends to be very vague and non-specific, whereas in Corinthians, Paul is very specific. He talks about a man sleeping with his stepmom. He talks about people not taking communion together at the right time. He talks about whether we should eat food sacrificed to idols or not. Those are very specific issues, whereas in Titus and Timothy and 2 Timothy, Paul is more vague about what the false teachings are. So these kinds of things all suggest that Paul himself did not write these, but instead somebody different than Paul comes along later to write 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus specifically here. Don't have a whole lot more to say about what's going on in Titus. Titus has a household code which emphasizes how we are supposed to behave. He emphasizes the idea of older people training younger people. Just because this is maybe not written by Paul himself does not mean that Titus is a less valuable letter in any way, shape, or form. It is a pretty straightforward letter, and a lot of the advice that the letter to Titus gives us is probably very valuable, very important stuff, especially this idea of older people, more experienced people training and teaching younger people. Here's a little bit about Timothy, the person who is supposedly the recipient of 1st and 2nd Timothy. We again think that 1st Timothy is probably not written by Paul for many of the same reasons that we discussed with the book of Titus. Now, one thing I do want to linger on a little bit more here is the background to the city of Ephesus, where Timothy is serving as a pastor, supposedly. If this letter is addressed to Timothy while he is in Ephesus, then we need to think about what's going on here in the city of Ephesus. In the city of Ephesus, there was a religious system that emphasized the worship of the goddess Artemis, also known as Diana. Artemis is the Greek name, Diana is the Roman Latin name of this goddess. Now she's going to be in charge of childbirth, and so she's going to be in charge of keeping women safe through the process of childbirth. And because childbirth in the ancient world was very dangerous, it's still a dangerous thing for women to go through. It's just that modern obstetrics have mitigated a lot of the risk of childbirth. Because childbirth is so dangerous for women to go through, the worship of the goddess Diana or Artemis is very popular with women, and as a result, the worship of Diana or Artemis makes this religion a little bit unusual in that women tended to take a more prominent role in this religion and even seem to be in charge of this particular religion. Now that's unusual in the ancient world, where for the most part men are in charge of just about everything. Now it's possible that this emphasis on female leadership in Ephesus might explain why Paul in 1 Timothy 2:12 mentions that women are not to be in authority over men. Let me read the passage to you here. Oh my, I'm in 2 Timothy. I've opened my Bible to the wrong spot. Apologies here while I flip. There we go. Paul says that we should let a woman learn in silence with full submission, and then here's 2:12, kind of the key verse that a lot of people focus their attention on, where Paul says, I permit no woman to teach or have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. It's possible that the reason why Paul talks about this role of female leadership, or the fact that women should not be in leadership, is that he's trying to contrast Christianity with what's going on in Ephesus at the time, where he sees that there is this female-led religion, and Paul is reluctant to allow Christianity to end up looking exactly like the cultural religion of that particular environment. So he restricts women's roles here and doesn't want them to be leading. And what the clue to us that he may be concerned about Christianity accidentally looking too much like the worship of Diana or Artemis comes to us in verse 15, where he says that women will be saved through childbearing. Now, another way of translating the word saved would be kept safe. So we could say that what Paul is saying in verse 15 is that women will be kept safe through childbearing. Well, why would he need to bring that up? It's possible he brings that up because notice that that Artemis is the goddess of childbirth. And so he's trying to say that Christian women are going to be protected by Jesus and not by Artemis, and that's how they're going to be kept safe through childbirth. And so it's not necessary for our religion to look exactly like this Greek religion, where we make women in charge of men. So if that's the case, it's possible that Paul's limitation of women's authority may be very specific and prompted exclusively by this particular environment here in the city of Ephesus. Now, there's other ways of reading this particular passage as well. It's possible that Paul means exactly what he is saying there. It's also possible the reason why he's limiting women's role is because they're not educated, and that's hinted at to us in verse 11, where he says that women should learn in silence with full submission, implying that women are not educated in this church and that they need to be taught first, and thus they cannot be in authoritative roles in this church yet. These are all possibilities. But I would like you to be familiar with this idea that in Ephesus, the goddess Artemis is has this very prominent role in society, especially among women. She's very popular because she keeps women safe through childbirth. All right, so to briefly recap what we talked about here, the pastoral epistles are all about church structure. They are trying to establish who can be a deacon, who can be an elder or a pastor or a bishop. A lot of people doubt that Paul himself wrote these particular letters because these are not issues Paul focuses on in his other letters. In addition to that, the historical narrative in these letters does not seem to match up with the historical narrative that we have elsewhere in the New Testament. And I want you to be familiar with this background to the city of Ephesus, which is the city where Timothy is hanging out when when Paul writes to Timothy this particular letter. All right, that wraps everything up that I wanted to talk about. Have a good day.